The palace of the Virealian queen stood silent, floating above a blue gas giant like a crown made of crystal and living metal. Inside its wide halls, fear had become normal. Servants walked carefully. Guards kept their distance. Scientists whispered. All of them feared the same thing, not the queen, but her children. The queen's cubs were born with minds too strong for their small bodies. From the moment they opened their eyes, they could feel emotions, thoughts, and memories around them. When they cried, walls cracked. When they laughed, lights exploded. When they became afraid, people were hurt. Many nannies had come. None had stayed. Some were trained caretakers from advanced species. Some were psychic specialists. Some were warriors meant to restrain the cubs if needed. Every one of them failed. A few lasted hours. A few lasted days. One lasted almost a week before collapsing in terror and begging to be taken away. The queen watched every failure with growing anger and pain. She loved her children, but she did not know how to protect them from themselves, or from the galaxy that was starting to fear them. If the cubs could not be controlled, the High Council would step in. That thought burned in her mind. So when the advisors suggested a human, the queen almost laughed. Humans were weak, short-lived. Their minds were unprotected. They had no natural psychic shields, no enhanced senses, no royal training. What could a human do, the queen asked coldly, that my people cannot? The answer came quietly. They feel differently. That was how the human was chosen. His name was Elias Ward. He was not a soldier or a scientist. He had once worked in disaster zones on human worlds, caring for orphaned children after wars and plagues. He had no psychic ability, no advanced armor, no hidden strength. When he arrived at the palace, he felt very small. The doors closed behind him with a deep sound. The air hummed with energy. He could feel pressure in his chest, as if the walls themselves were watching him. Guards with glowing eyes followed him closely, ready to pull him away at the first sign of danger. He was taken to a wide chamber made of smooth stone and soft light. At the center of the room stood the alien queen. She was tall, her form graceful and powerful, her crown floating above her head like a ring of stars. Her eyes studied the human carefully. "You know why you are here," she said. Elias nodded. His voice was steady, though his heart beat fast. "Yes, your majesty. My children have broken every caretaker before you," the queen said, "some mentally, some physically." "I understand," Elias replied. "You may be harmed. I understand. You may die." Elias paused, then nodded again. "I understand." The queen watched him closely. She sensed no hidden lies, no arrogance, only fear and something else, acceptance. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. Elias thought for a moment. "Because children don't choose how they are born," he said, "and because someone has to stay." The queen said nothing more. She gestured and the doors to the inner chamber opened. The cubs were inside. There were 3 of them. They were small, covered in soft shifting patterns of light instead of fur. Their eyes glowed faintly. Energy pulsed around them like heat from fire. Toys lay broken across the floor, melted or crushed. The moment Elias stepped inside, the room trembled. The cubs felt him. A wave of emotion hit him, fear, anger, confusion, loneliness, all at once. His vision blurred. He nearly fell to his knees, but he forced himself to breathe. The cubs turned toward him. One hissed softly. Another raised its small claws. The third simply stared, eyes shining too brightly. Guards tensed. Elias slowly knelt down. He did not reach out. He did not speak right away. He simply lowered himself to their level and sat on the floor. "I'm Elias," he said gently. "I'm not here to hurt you." The cubs did not understand his words, but they felt his tone. Confusion flickered through the room. The pressure did not increase. It paused. One cub sent out a sharp psychic pulse, a test. Elias winced as pain flashed behind his eyes. Memories surfaced without his control. A ruined city, crying children, long nights with no sleep. He swallowed and stayed where he was. "That hurt," he said honestly. "But I'm still here." The cubs reacted with surprise. No one had ever stayed after that. Another cub sent an image into his mind, fire, screaming, fear. Elias closed his eyes. He let the image pass through him. When he opened them, his voice was calm. "That was scary," he said. "I'm sorry you feel that way." The room shook slightly, then settled. The queen watched from behind the barrier, her expression unreadable. Hours passed. Elias did not try to control the cubs. He did not demand obedience. He spoke softly, describing simple things. He talked about the sound of rain on metal roofs, about warm food, about sitting quietly when the world felt too loud. When the cubs grew restless, he stayed calm. When they tested him again, he endured it. Eventually, exhaustion took him. He leaned against the wall, eyes heavy. One cub approached him slowly. It touched his hand. Elias did not move. The cub felt his warmth, his steady breathing, his tired but unbroken mind. For the first time since their birth, the cubs felt something new: safety. When the palace lights dimmed to night cycle, the cubs curled near him without realizing it. Their energy softened. The room remained whole. The guards stared in disbelief. The queen felt her chest tighten. The human had lasted one full day. By the second day, the cubs grew bolder. They pushed harder. One created illusions of monsters. Another flooded the room with loud psychic noise. Elias covered his ears, grimaced, but did not shout. "Too much," he said firmly but gently. "Let's slow down." He showed them simple breathing, exaggerating his movements. Inhale, exhale, slow, steady. The cubs watched. One copied him, then another. The noise faded. By the third day, Elias was exhausted. Dark circles formed under his eyes. His head ached constantly. The palace medics begged him to rest. "I will," he said, "when they rest." That night, one cub woke screaming. Energy surged out of control. Cracks formed in the ceiling. Alarms began to sound. Elias ran toward the cub without hesitation. He wrapped his arms around the small, glowing body, ignoring the burning pain on his skin. "I've got you," he whispered. "You're not alone." The cub's fear poured into him like a storm. He shook. He cried out, but he did not let go. Slowly, the energy faded. The palace did not fall. The alarms stopped. The cub slept in his arms. The queen arrived moments later, her eyes wide. "You should be dead," she said softly. Elias looked up at her, pale and shaking, but alive. "They just needed someone to stay," he replied. The queen looked at her children, calm, sleeping peacefully for the first time. In that moment, something ancient and proud inside her shifted. For the first time, hope entered the palace. And the galaxy, watching from afar, had no idea that everything was about to change. The next days passed slowly inside the palace, but nothing was the same anymore. Word spread quietly among the servants and guards that the human was still alive. More than that, the cubs had not harmed anyone since his arrival. Doors that were once sealed stayed open. Guards lowered their weapons, though they never left their posts. Elias Ward woke each morning with his body aching and his mind heavy, but when he opened his eyes, he always found at least one cub nearby. Sometimes they slept close to him. Sometimes they watched him silently, glowing softly like small stars. They were learning. The cubs began to understand patterns. When Elias sat, they sat. When he spoke softly, the pressure in the room lowered. When he closed his eyes and breathed slowly, the wild energy inside them followed his rhythm. It was not perfect. There were still sudden spikes of power, sudden emotional waves that shook the walls, but they always returned to calm faster than before. The queen observed everything. She stood behind unseen barriers, her presence hidden but her attention sharp. For the first time since the cubs were born, she did not feel constant fear when she thought of them. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar: trust, not in her own strength, but in the fragile human who slept on the floor beside her children. Other members of the royal court were less calm. Scientists demanded explanations. Advisors whispered that the human must be influencing the cubs in dangerous ways. Military leaders warned that emotional bonds could weaken royal authority. Some believed Elias was only delaying disaster. On the fourth day, the pressure reached its peak. The High Council demanded a demonstration. If the cubs are truly improving, one counselor said through a projection, we must see control under stress. The Queen's jaw tightened. She did not like this, but refusing would raise suspicion. The galaxy was watching. Elias was informed shortly after. They want to test the cubs, a palace official said carefully, with controlled stimulation. Elias felt his stomach tighten. What kind of stimulation? The official hesitated. Psychic pressure, emotional conflict, fear simulations. Elias shook his head immediately. They're children. They are weapons, the official corrected. Elias looked toward the inner chamber where the cubs were playing quietly, stacking broken toys into strange shapes. They don't have to be. The Queen herself appeared then, dismissing the official with a single gesture. They will proceed, she said. But I will allow you to remain. Elias nodded, though fear crawled through his chest. He knelt beside the cubs and placed a hand on the floor so they could feel his presence. Something is coming, he thought. And somehow they knew it too. The chamber lights dimmed. The psychic field activated. At first it was subtle, a distant feeling of unease. The cubs stiffened, their glow intensifying. Elias felt the air grow heavy like before a storm. One cub whimpered. Elias spoke softly. I'm here, breathe with me. The pressure increased. Images flooded the room, threats, danger, isolation. The cubs' fear rose quickly. Cracks appeared in the walls. The floor trembled. Elias' vision blurred as pain stabbed through his head. He nearly collapsed but forced himself to stay upright. He placed himself between the cubs and the center of the room as if his body could block the force. Look at me, he said firmly, his voice shaking but strong. Look at me. One cub focused on him, then another. The third struggled, its energy surging wildly. The psychic pressure spiked. Elias screamed as memories he had buried deep rose violently. Loss, failure, children he could not save. Tears streamed down his face, but he did not turn away. It's okay to be scared, he said through clenched teeth. But you are not alone. The cub lashed out instinctively, a burst of raw power ripping across the room. Guards raised their weapons. Alarms began to sound. The Queen took a step forward, her hands glowing, ready to intervene. Elias threw his arms around the cub. The energy burned his skin. His muscles locked. His scream echoed through the chamber, but he did not let go. I'm here, he repeated. I won't leave. The cub's fear slammed into him again and again, but something changed. The cub felt the human's pain and his choice to stay anyway. Slowly the power faded. The psychic field shut down abruptly. Silence fell. The walls remained standing. Elias collapsed to the floor, barely conscious. The cubs huddled around him, their glow dim and steady. The chamber doors opened. No one spoke for a long time. The High Council ended the test immediately. Medical teams rushed in, but the Queen stopped them with a raised hand. She knelt beside Elias herself, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. He was breathing, alive. You disobeyed instinct, she said quietly when his eyes fluttered open. Elias managed a weak smile. That's kind of our thing. The Queen looked at her children, then back at the human. Something hardened behind her eyes, not anger but resolve. From this moment, she announced to the watching court, no test will be conducted without my consent. The reaction was mixed. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked unsettled. The cubs were changing too fast. That night, Elias slept for almost a full cycle. When he woke, he found the cubs had placed small glowing objects around him in a loose circle, their version of protection. He laughed softly, then winced from the pain in his ribs. Over the next days, the cubs began to show new behaviors. They waited before acting. They reacted to Elias' tone more than his words. When he showed frustration, they pulled back. When he laughed, their energy brightened without becoming unstable. They were learning empathy. Scientists recorded everything in stunned silence. One evening, while Elias sat telling the cubs a simple story about a human child afraid of the dark, a palace alarm suddenly rang. An unknown ship had entered restricted space. Guards rushed to stations. The palace shields flared. Fear spiked instantly inside the cubs. The room shook. Elias stood quickly. "Hey," he said, steady and loud enough to cut through the panic. "Stay with me." The cubs turned toward him, trembling. "I need you to listen," he said. "Nothing bad has happened yet." The fear did not vanish, but it did not explode. For the first time, the cubs waited. The threat turned out to be a diplomatic vessel with a damaged navigation system. No attack, no danger. When the all-clear sounded, Elias slumped into a chair, exhausted. The cubs remained calm. The queen watched the scene from afar, her heart heavy with understanding. The human was not suppressing their power. He was teaching them how to live with it. By the end of the week, something impossible had happened. The cubs had not injured anyone. They had not destroyed a single wall. They had listened. The palace no longer felt like a cage, and across the galaxy, whispers began to spread. The alien queen's children were changing. And it was because of a human who refused to leave. The change inside the palace did not go unnoticed. What began as quiet whispers among servants soon reached the wider empire. Reports were sent. Data was analyzed. Videos of the cubs remaining calm during stressful moments spread through secure channels. Many did not believe them. Control without force was considered impossible. Elias felt the pressure growing even before anyone spoke to him about it. Guards watched him more closely now. Scientists asked sharper questions. Advisors stopped pretending to be polite. He was still allowed to stay with the cubs, but the atmosphere had changed. The palace was no longer only afraid of the cubs. It was afraid of what the human represented. On the 10th day, Elias noticed the cubs behaving differently. They were quieter, more focused. They did not test him as often. Instead, they watched everything around them carefully. When servants entered the chamber, the cubs observed their emotions. When guards tensed, the cubs leaned closer to Elias. They were learning from everyone, not just him. That worried Elias. Power without guidance was dangerous, but learning too fast could be just as risky. That concern became real when one of the cubs, smallest of the three, suddenly collapsed during play. There was no explosion, no psychic burst, just a sharp drop in energy. Elias was beside the cub instantly. "Hey," he whispered, gently lifting the small glowing body. "I've got you." The cub's light flickered weakly. Medical teams rushed in, scanning rapidly. The lead physician hesitated, confused. "There is no physical damage," she said. "No injury, no illness." "Then what's wrong?" Elias asked. The physician looked uneasy. "Mental overload. Emotional strain. The cub is holding too much in." Elias swallowed hard. The cubs had learned to control themselves, but they had not learned how to release their fear safely. The queen arrived soon after, her expression dark. "Explain," she commanded. Elias stood slowly, still holding the cub. "They're doing what you asked," he said quietly. "They're restraining their power, but they're children. They don't know how to process everything they feel." The queen's claws tightened at her side. "You believe this is our fault." "I believe," Elias replied carefully, "that they've been told what not to be but never shown what they can be." The silence that followed was heavy. The cub recovered after hours of rest, but the message was clear. Control alone was not enough. That night, Elias sat awake long after the cubs fell asleep. His body hurt. His mind felt stretched thin. He wondered how long he could keep going. The answer came sooner than expected. The High Council issued a formal summons. Elias was brought into a circular chamber filled with towering projections of alien leaders. Their eyes were cold, their voices calm but sharp. "The human caretaker has exceeded his original purpose," one counselor said. "He has interfered with royal development." "I'm keeping them alive," Elias replied. "You are weakening them." Elias clenched his fists. "You're wrong." Humans often believe emotion is strength, another counselor said, but in our history, emotion has destroyed civilizations. Elias took a breath. Then maybe, he said slowly, you've been afraid of the wrong thing. Murmurs spread through the chamber. The queen watched silently. The counselor leaned forward. We propose a final evaluation. Elias' heart sank. No. The cubs will be placed in a simulated crisis, the counselor continued. One that requires decision, restraint, and power. You will not be allowed to intervene. Elias stepped forward. That will break them, or reveal the truth. The queen finally spoke. If he stays, she said, if he stands with them. The council paused. He may observe, the counselor said. Nothing more. The chamber went dark. The simulation began. The cubs were moved into a vast chamber designed to mimic an external attack. Alarms blared. The environment shifted. Fear signals flooded their minds. Elias stood behind a transparent barrier. Stay with me, he whispered, though he knew they could not hear him clearly. The cubs panicked at first. Energy surged. The chamber shook. The smallest cub trembled violently. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of lashing out, one cub turned to the others. It reached out not with power but with emotion. A shared calm, imperfect but real. The second cub responded. The third hesitated, then joined. Their energy synchronized. Elias' breath caught. The simulation escalated, the threat intensified. The chamber demanded action. The cubs did not attack blindly. They focused. They shaped their power carefully, redirecting energy instead of releasing it. Shields formed. The environment stabilized. The council watched in stunned silence. Then the smallest cub cried out. The strain was too much. Elias' hand slammed against the barrier. Stop it, he shouted. They're done. The council hesitated. The cub collapsed again, its glow fading dangerously. Elias did not wait. He ran. Alarms screamed as he crossed the barrier line. Security systems flared. Pain tore through his body as energy struck him, but he pushed forward. He reached the cub and fell to his knees, pulling the small body against his chest. I'm here, he said desperately. You don't have to carry it all. The cub's fear flooded into him, stronger than ever. Elias screamed as his mind was overwhelmed. He felt himself slipping, consciousness fading, but he held on. The cub's light steadied. The simulation shut down. Silence returned. Elias collapsed fully this time, unconscious. When he woke, he was in a medical chamber. The air was quiet. The pain was deep and constant. The queen stood beside him. You defied the council, she said. Elias winced. I did. You risked your life. I know. She looked at him for a long time. You were willing to die for them. Elias met her gaze. I was willing to stay. The queen turned toward the observation window where the cubs rested peacefully, all three together. They chose restraint, she said softly. Not because they were commanded, but because they understood why. She faced him again. The council wanted proof of control, she continued. You showed them responsibility. Elias exhaled slowly. The queen straightened. From this moment, she said, her voice carrying authority, you are no longer merely a caretaker. Elias frowned. Then what am I? She considered the question. Family, she answered. The cubs sensed him waking and stirred. Their glow brightened gently without instability. Elias smiled weakly. Outside the palace, messages were already spreading across the empire. The alien queen's cubs had faced crisis and chosen control, not through fear, not through force, but through something the galaxy had long dismissed. Human compassion. The days after the council incident were calm on the surface, but underneath the palace felt tense, like a breath being held too long. Elias recovered slowly. His body healed faster than his mind. Loud sounds made him flinch. Sudden emotions made his head ache. But whenever he struggled, the cubs were there. They stayed close to him now, not out of fear but choice. They had changed. The cubs no longer reacted instantly to every emotion around them. When fear appeared, they paused. When anger passed nearby, they watched instead of striking. They still felt everything deeply, but they had learned something new: space between feeling and action. That space was everything. The queen noticed it first during a council meeting. One of the cubs sat beside her throne, watching the projection of distant leaders argue loudly. In the past, such sharp emotions would have caused damage. Now, the cub only tilted its head and leaned slightly toward Elias, who stood quietly nearby. No surge, no tremor. The room stayed intact. The queen felt a strange tightness in her chest, pride mixed with fear, because if the cubs could learn this much so quickly, others would notice. And they did. News spread beyond the empire's inner systems. Rival powers began sending diplomatic messages. Some asked questions, others made offers. A few made threats hidden behind polite words. The cubs were no longer seen as a danger to be controlled. They were seen as assets to be claimed. Elias sensed it in the way guards doubled, in the way the queen no longer slept deeply, in the way the cubs watched the stars longer than before, feeling distant emotions pressing against the palace like invisible hands. Something was coming. It arrived without warning. A fleet appeared at the edge of the system, unmarked ships using advanced stealth. Alarms rang across the palace, shields activated. Military leaders shouted orders. The cubs felt it instantly. Fear rippled through them, sharp and cold. The youngest cub trembled, light flickering. Elias knelt in front of them. "Stay with me," he said, calm but firm. "We don't know what they want yet." The queen entered the chamber, her armor forming around her body. "They are not responding to hails," she said. "Their trajectory suggests invasion." The cubs looked up at her. In the past, the queen would have ordered them to prepare, to unleash power, to become weapons. She did not. She looked at Elias instead. "What do we do?" she asked. It was not weakness, it was trust. Elias took a slow breath. "We protect people first," he said. "Not pride, not territory, lives." The queen nodded once. "Then we do it your way." The fleet attacked the outer defenses. Shockwaves traveled through space. The palace shook. Distant explosions lit the sky. The cubs cried out together, fear spiking. Elias placed his hands on the floor, grounding himself. "Listen," he said. "Feel each other. You're not alone." The cubs pressed closer, their energy brushing against each other, seeking balance. The attackers broke through the first defense ring. Panic spread across the city below the palace. Millions of minds screamed silently into the void. The cubs felt them all. They gasped, overwhelmed by pain and terror that did not belong to them. Elias' voice cut through it. "You don't have to stop everything," he said. "Just help where you can." The cubs looked at him, confused. "You don't have to win the war," he continued. "Just save lives." Something clicked. The eldest cub stepped forward. Instead of releasing raw power outward, it focused inward, shaping the energy carefully, the way Elias had taught them: slow, controlled, intentional. A shield formed, not around the palace, around the city. A vast, shimmering barrier rose, catching falling debris, redirecting shockwaves, softening impacts. Buildings stopped collapsing. Fires dimmed. The second cub joined in, reinforcing weak points, adjusting the flow. The third cub hesitated, fear rising again. Elias met its gaze. "You can help," he said gently, "but you don't have to carry it alone." The cub reached out to the others. Together, their power stabilized. The queen stared in disbelief as reports flooded in. Civilian casualties dropped sharply. The attackers had not expected resistance like this. Angered, the enemy fleet changed tactics. They targeted the palace directly. Massive weapons charged. Elias felt the cubs tense. This threat was personal now. "Remember," he said quickly, "power follows emotion. Don't let fear lead." The cubs focused, but the pressure was intense. The weapons fired. The impact slammed into the palace shields, cracking them. The cubs cried out as feedback surged into them. The youngest cub faltered, energy slipping out of control. Elias ran to it without thinking, pulling it close. Pain burned through his arms, but he held on. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe." The queen raised her hands, preparing to intervene, but she stopped when she saw the cub steady. The eldest cub made a decision. Instead of defending only, it redirected its power outward, not as destruction but as disruption. The enemy ship's systems failed. Lights went dark, engines stalled, confusion spread through the fleet. The second cub amplified the effect, carefully, precisely. The attackers panicked. Within minutes, the fleet was disabled, drifting helplessly. The battle ended not with fire, but silence. Across the system, people stared in shock. The cubs collapsed together, exhausted but stable. Elias sank to the floor beside them, shaking, relief washing over him. The queen stood frozen, staring at the star-filled view beyond the palace. They had defended an empire, not by destroying, but by choosing control. Later, as emergency crews worked and diplomats scrambled, the queen addressed her people. Her voice carried across the empire. "Today," she said, "we were attacked by those who saw my children as weapons." She paused, letting the words sink in. They were wrong. She gestured toward the cubs, resting beside the human. "My children chose restraint. They chose protection. They chose responsibility." The message spread fast. So did the truth. The cubs were no longer monsters. They were leaders in the making. And beside them stood a human, injured, exhausted, and smiling softly as the cubs slept. Elias did not hear the cheers or the declarations. He only felt small hands resting against his arm, warm and steady. For the first time since the cubs were born, the palace felt safe. But beyond the stars, other powers were already watching. And not all of them had learned the same lesson. The days after the battle felt unreal, like the palace itself was unsure how to behave now that fear no longer ruled it. Repairs continued across the city, but there was no panic. People spoke calmly. Children played in open streets again. For the first time in many cycles, the empire breathed without fear of its own future. The cubs slept for a long time after the battle. Elias stayed beside them, barely leaving the chamber. Medics treated his burns and exhaustion, but he refused full rest. Whenever he closed his eyes, he felt the echo of their fear, their trust, and the weight of what they had done. They had saved millions. They were still children. When the cubs finally woke, they were different again. Not weaker, not stronger, just steadier. Their glow was softer, more controlled. When they felt emotions from outside the palace, they did not drown in them. They noticed them, acknowledged them, then let them pass. They had learned balance. The queen visited quietly, without guards or ceremony. She knelt on the floor, something no ruler of her kind had done before others. "You protected my people," she said softly. The cubs looked at her, then at Elias. They pressed closer to him. The queen felt no anger, only understanding. "You chose him," she said, "not as a tool, not as a shield." Her voice lowered. "As family." Elias shifted uncomfortably. "They did the hard part," he said. "I just stayed." The queen studied him carefully. "You stayed when our own people ran," she replied. "You stayed when death was certain. You stayed when power itself tried to break you." She rose slowly. "You changed the future of this empire." That future arrived faster than anyone expected. The High Council called an emergency gathering, not to test, not to threaten, but to decide. The chamber was filled with tension. Leaders from across the empire appeared as towering projections. Many had once argued for containment. Some had suggested exile. A few had quietly planned worse. Now none of them spoke easily. The queen stood tall, the cubs visible beside her, Elias standing slightly behind them. "The events of recent cycles cannot be undone," a counselor began. "The cubs have shown unprecedented restraint and capability." "Yes," another added, "but that power remains dangerous." Elias stepped forward before the queen could respond. "Power always is," he said calmly. "That's why you don't teach fear, you teach responsibility." The counselor narrowed its eyes. "You speak as if you understand empires." "I understand children," Elias replied, "and they become what you treat them as." Silence followed. Then slowly, one counselor spoke words that changed everything. "What do the cubs want?" No one had ever asked that. The queen turned to her children. "You may answer," she said gently. The cubs shared a quiet moment between themselves. Their thoughts flowed together, then one stepped forward. Its voice was soft, echoing in every mind. "We want to protect," it said. "Not destroy." Another added, "We want to learn." The smallest cub hesitated, then said, "We want him to stay." The chamber erupted in murmurs. A human, permanent, at the center of royal development. Unthinkable. The queen raised her hand and silence returned. "Then it is decided," she said. "Elia's ward will remain." A counselor protested weakly. "As what?" The queen did not hesitate. "As guardian of the heirs." The title carried ancient weight. The decision sent shockwaves through the galaxy. Other species watched closely. Some were afraid, some were curious, some were inspired. Humans, long dismissed as fragile and insignificant, suddenly became something else. Teachers of monsters. Weeks passed. Elias settled into a new routine, not as a servant, not as a prisoner, but as family. He taught the cubs simple human things: games, stories, patience, humor. He taught them how to fail without fear, how to rest, how to say no to their own power. The cubs taught him too. They showed him how to listen deeper than words, how to feel without being consumed, how to stand in silence and still be strong. The queen watched it all. One evening she joined them as Elias told a story about Earth, about oceans, rain, and skies that changed color. The cubs listened closely, imagining a world without constant psychic noise. "Do humans fear their children?" one cub asked suddenly. Elias thought for a moment. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "but we're learning not to." The queen looked away, her expression unreadable. Later that night, alarms sounded again. Not attack alarms, arrival signals. A fleet entered the system openly, without weapons charged. Representatives from multiple species requested audience. They had seen what happened. They wanted to understand. They wanted to learn. The queen met them in the grand hall. Elias stood beside the cubs. "You fear power," the queen said to the gathered leaders. "So did we," she gestured toward the cubs. "We tried to control what we did not understand." Her gaze shifted to Elias. "Then a human taught us a different way." The message spread across the galaxy. Humanity was invited, not as soldiers, not as labor, but as caretakers, mediators, and teachers. Not because they were strongest, but because they stayed. Elias never asked for recognition. He never wanted statues or titles. When offered land, wealth, and honor, he refused most of it. "I already have everything I need," he said quietly. The cubs grew, slowly and safely. Their power expanded, but their control grew faster. They learned leadership by watching the queen and compassion by watching Elias. Years later, when the cubs stood tall and strong, no longer children but not yet rulers, the galaxy no longer feared them. They were known as the calm heirs, and the story of how it all began was told everywhere, not as a tale of war, not as a legend of conquest, but as the moment when a single human chose to sit on the floor with frightened children and refused to leave. In a universe obsessed with strength, humanity had done the impossible. They proved that kindness could shape the future. And that sometimes, the bravest act was simply staying when everyone else ran.